Properties of rational and irrational numbers. Our learning target: why is the sum or product of rational numbers rational? Why is the sum or product of irrational numbers irrational? And why is the product of a non-zero rational number and an irrational number irrational? Before we start our activity, we need to review rational and irrational numbers. A rational number is a real number that can be written as a simple fraction. 1 5/10 is a rational number because 1 5/10 equals 3/2. There are other examples of rational numbers in the table below. Irrational numbers. An irrational number is a real number that cannot be written as a simple fraction. Irrational means not rational. The square roots of numbers that are not perfect squares and pi are some examples of irrational numbers. Our task: experiment with sums and products of two numbers from the following list to answer the questions that follow: 5, 1/2, 0, square root of 2, negative square root of 2, 1 over the square root of 2, and pi. Based on the above information, conjecture which of the statements is always true, which is sometimes true, and which is never true. So if we take the sum of a rational number and a rational number, is it always rational? Is the sum of a rational number and an irrational number always irrational? Is the sum of an irrational number and an irrational number always irrational? Is the product of a rational number and a rational number always rational? Is the product of a rational number and an irrational number irrational? And is the product of an irrational number and an irrational number always irrational? So some examples of sum of rational numbers include 5 plus 1/2 equals 5 1/2, 5 plus 0 equals 5, and 1/2 plus 0 equals 1/2. Examples of the sum of rational numbers and an irrational number include 5 plus the square root of 2. 5 and the square root of 2 are not like terms or like radicals, so we cannot combine them. So when you add them together, it stays 5 plus the square root of 2. The same thing with 5 plus negative square root of 2. That equals 5 plus negative square root of 2. And 5 plus pi equals 5 plus pi. These are some of my examples of adding a rational number with an irrational number. Examples of finding the sum of an irrational number added to another irrational number include the square root of 2 plus negative square root of 2, that equals 0. The square root of 2 plus pi, that equals the square root of 2 plus pi. And the square root of 2 plus 1 over the square root of 2. After we rationalize the denominator, it becomes the square root of 2 plus the square root of 2 over 2. Examples of multiplying rational numbers together: 5 times 0 equals 0. 5 times 1/2 equals 5 over 2, which is 2 and 1/2, and 1/2 times 0 equals 0. Examples of finding the product of a rational number multiplied to an irrational number include 5 times the square root of 2 equals 5 times the square root of 2. 1/2 times pi equals pi over 2. And 0 times 1 over the square root of 2 equals 0. My examples of multiplying two irrational numbers together include the square root of 2 times negative square root of 2, which would be negative square root of 4, or negative 2. The square root of 2 times 1 over the square root of 2 equals 1. and the square root of 2 times pi equals pi times the square root of 2. Now that we have our examples, let's see if we can decide whether or not our statements are true. If I were to add two rational numbers together, would it be a rational answer? Yes, that's always true. When I add an irrational number to a rational number, is it always irrational? Yes. When I add a rational and an irrational number, it is always irrational. If I add an irrational number and another irrational number, is it always irrational? No. The square root of 2 plus pi is the square root of 2 plus pi, and that is irrational. And in most cases, you would get an irrational number. However, the square root of 2 plus negative square root of 2 is 0, and 0 is a rational number. So this is not always true. When you multiply a rational number and another rational number, it will always be a rational answer. When you multiply a rational number and an irrational number, is it always irrational? No. 5 times the square root of 2 is 5 times the square root of 2. That is irrational. 1/2 times pi is pi over 2. That is also irrational. Whenever you multiply by 0, your answer will be 0. So that is the one case that makes this sometimes, because a 0 answer is a rational answer. So when you multiply a rational number and an irrational number, it is not always irrational. 0 is our special case. Is the product of an irrational number and an irrational number always irrational? No. The square root of 2 times negative square root of 2 is negative square root of 4, which simplifies to negative 2. The square root of 2 times 1 over the square root of 2 is 1. Negative 2 and 1 are rational. So sometimes you will get an irrational answer, but other times you can get a rational answer. So in our review or conclusion, if we add a rational number to a rational number, it will always be rational. If we add a rational number and an irrational number, it will always be irrational. If we add an irrational number and another irrational number together, it will sometimes be irrational. If we multiply a rational number and another rational number, it will always be rational. If we multiply a rational number and an irrational number, sometimes it's irrational. And if we multiply an irrational number and an irrational number together, it is sometimes irrational.